Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Okay, welcome back. On this episode, my guests are Doctors Jenny and Stephen Bepko, two retired Air Force physicians who are now traveling around the world with their children. In this episode, we talk about their careers in the military, the nuances of the military medical system, their experience with finances and deployment, and finally, we talk about their world tour with their children. I hope this episode gives you insight and appreciation of military medicine. I also hope that more of us use the Bepko's example to do something interesting and unique while you're still young. It's not just about saving to reach higher and higher net worth. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. My guests today are Dr. Stephen and Jenny Bepko, recently retired lieutenant colonels from the Air Force. Stephen is a radiologist and Jenny is a family medicine physician, and they recently retired back in July, I think, and now they are traveling the globe for a year with their children. A bit of background, I worked with Stephen. He was my commanding officer at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, and Jenny was one of the founders and teaching attendings of the family medicine residency at Nellis. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Yes, you are my second international guest, and this is the first South American one that I've had. So very nice, although you yourselves are not South American, obviously. So tell me a little bit about your backgrounds and how you guys got into medicine, and then a little bit about your military experience.
All right. So this is Jenny here. I was raised in the military. My father was a dentist. He retired in the Air Force. And so I had always looked at that as a way of funding school. As far as being a physician, I was one of those that decided early on that I was going to pursue medicine. And so I really didn't entertain other possibilities. I applied for the scholarship for medical school while I was in college, and then went on to medical school and residency with the Air Force. And although it was fairly certain that I would serve till retirement, there were times that we considered whether that was the right choice. But we did our 20.
Yes.
Yeah, I was a little different. I wasn't somebody who was going to be a doctor growing up. In fact, I was going to create like genetic dinosaurs and such. And then I realized that my major, biomedical engineering, was actually creating artificial hearts and such, and not genetically modified dinosaurs. So in college, most of my friends were actually applying to med school. I actually wanted to fly for the Air Force, but I couldn't because of my eyesight. And my dad told me about the flight surgeon route. So flight surgeons are medical doctors in the Air Force, but they're attached to flying squadrons. They get to wear a flight suit, and basically they get to fly or ride along on the plane. So I actually went to med school as a kind of a roundabout way of getting into the flying career field of the Air Force. So I applied, got accepted for the scholarship. They paid for my medical school. I did 1 year as a journal intern, as a surgical intern, in order to get your license. And then I went off and did flight medicine for 5 years before deciding to go back to residency as a radiologist. So a little bit different route for the two of us.
Right. And I think that those are, especially yours, Stephen, is a common thing that happens in the military as you come in, and then a lot of people do go into flight medicine, specifically in the Air Force. But let's talk a little bit about practicing in the military. So you get out of med school. Jenny, you did your residency through the Air Force?
Yes.
Okay. And like Stephen, you said that you did a year of general surgery. So were you guys married at the time? Where were you stationed?
We married intern year. So we were geographically separated by about 3 or 4 hours, that internship. And that was before any of the work restrictions, duty hours, any of that. So geographically separated, and because of residency, quite separated. We were only seeing each other probably once a month, once every 6 weeks for that first year. And then after Stephen completed his internship, he was able to transfer over to the base that I was doing my residency.
So her last 2 years of residency, I was actually, quote, a staff physician, although I was only barely able to practice because I had my 1 year of internship out of the way. So I had my license, but certainly wasn't board certified or board eligible or residency trained.
There were a lot of
that
phone
particular
calls.
type. Yeah.
Phone calls to me during the day.
Yeah, I was doing basically general medicine, family medicine light, which was right up her alley. So it was certainly nice being able to call her. Of course, we weren't texting at that time because you couldn't text, but I'd call her and ask her, what blood pressure medication and how do I treat, ear infections and that sort of stuff. So,
and as a flight medicine doc, you were predominantly working with the flyers and the crew. Is that correct?
Correct. So basically, I would usually have 3.5 days of clinic a week. I'd usually have a half day to inspect. We actually kind of fell into the public health realm. So the flight surgeon had to go inspect the various occupational medicine shops. We also had to do like health inspections of the golf course snack bar and that sort of stuff. So 3.5 days of clinic, usually about a half a day of site visits. And then we had usually a fly day a week. And so we were given a day a week where we could make sure we had our crew rest, show up, and we were supposed to fly with our squadrons, not only to establish camaraderie with the pilots so that they would trust you, with their medical problems and concerns, but also so that you understood some of the physiology of flight. Again, certain things on the ground really aren't that big of a deal, such as a sinus infection or, nasal congestion, et cetera. But at altitude, they can cause some pretty significant problems. So it was a pretty nice lifestyle.
So that's obviously, that experience is pretty unique to the military. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of practicing in the military. So what are some of the pros that you saw? Obviously, flight medicine being kind of a unique avenue. What else would you say is a pro?
I think you're taking care of folks that have worn the uniform or are family members of someone who wore the uniform. And so even on those bad days when you're just did not have a good encounter or you feel overworked, you weren't making money for a health insurance company or making money for a CEO. You're taking care of people who served alongside of you or served before you. So the whole picture of things, that service before self, and that was always something that's unique, and I think it was a pro.
Plus, early on in our careers, 19, 18 years ago, you still had quite a few World War II veterans that were coming in. I would do minor surgery on these guys and find out they were at, Normandy Beach, and obviously there's still a couple of World War II veterans, around, but not as much as there were 18, 19 years ago. So some of these guys at the time, they were pretty much all male, had some really, really good stories.
Even the last 10 years when I've been teaching, I'm doing a lot of more hospital medicine. And whenever there'd be a World War II vet, just take time and pull up a chair and just listen to the stories. Not worry about medicine, but just get to know that person. I'm sure you do that somewhat in civilian side, but I think that just that military connection was unique and special.
One of the other pros is that you really didn't have to worry about building your practice. It was basically socialized medicine. You get paid whether you saw one patient or whether you saw 20 patients, obviously that's good on the 1 to 5 patient days. It's not good on the 30, 35 patient days, but you really could focus on actually just doing the medicine as opposed to, generating a practice and making sure that people came in. So that was certainly a pro.
Right. Your nurses were provided for you. Your techs were provided for you. So you didn't, unless they were civilian hire, you weren't doing a lot of the hiring. You were doing mentoring and training, but you didn't worry about someone not showing up for work or quitting on a moment's notice as long as they weren't your civilian hire. I think we worked with one healthcare system. So you had one set of rules that you had to learn. You had one formulary. You didn't really need to know about billing. Maybe a little bit in the last few years, but the Air Force doesn't make its money from billing, and so that wasn't a priority. So really only having to learn one set of rules, I think, is a lot easier than on the civilian side.
Good. Absolutely. The people who wore the uniform, the camaraderie, I think that's very unique to military medicine. I think a little bit people who work at the VA get that, but being part of the military is a unique experience. And the camaraderie that people share there, I think it elevates the purpose that you are there for already in medicine. So let's talk about some of the cons now. So I'm sure there are some negatives that you've experienced.
Well, for starters, one of the things, especially starting your career, I mean, we were lucky that, Jenny always wanted to be a family medicine physician, and the Air Force will always need family medicine physicians. So there was really no chance that the Air Force would not allow her to do her, chosen field. When I decided to become a radiologist, and you and I basically decided about the same time, the Air Force needed a whole bunch of them. A couple of years before or a couple of years after, it might not have been possible to become a radiologist. And certainly if you had your heart set on being a pediatric cardiologist, that's not going to happen. So the Air Force wasn't going to train you in a field that they didn't feel was necessary. So that's kind of the biggest con right out of the bat. Maybe not for some of your listeners who are, already doctors and stuff, but coming right out the gate, we knew people who weren't able to do what they wanted to do because the Air Force already had 3 pediatric surgeons, and they really didn't need a 4th.
I think the mobility tempo. We did several years before on active duty status before 9/11 happened, but there was a definite shift in the tempo and the mobility. And so our forced vacations to undesirable locations could be a con. I mean, it's a great experience to serve in that way. But when it's happened multiple times to the same family, it becomes a con.
Right. Let's just go into that a little bit, because I think a lot of the listeners are probably, unfamiliar with the frequency of deployments, especially during the peak of the wars that we had in the 2000s. And we still have, correct. But I think it's, even at the time while I was in the military, you felt like you were, a part of it. And then you talked to civilian colleagues and they really weren't aware. So to that degree, it's even become more of an issue now that people don't really know what's happening. So talk about your experience specifically during that time.
I deployed once to Afghanistan for, 4 or 5 something months back in 07, 08. I had a couple training missions were more humanitarian, and so those weren't desert locations. The last 4 years, probably the last 7 years, you really see the tempo. And part of that was when I deployed back at Nellis. My last 4 years at Travis, I was shielded and I was undeployable. So that was actually a blessing in disguise because I knew I was going to be able to stay home. But we at any point had 1 to 3 docs deployed 100% of the time. And that's from a teaching program. And so somebody leaves and the rest of us are picking up the extra weeks on service and the nights of call and the precepting duties. I mean, you don't get a replacement. And so the tempo at Travis the last 4 years and my department was definitely there. It wasn't a question of if someone was going to go. It was a question of when they were going to get notified that they were leaving. Because we expected to always have 1 to 2 docs gone at a time.
Out of how many would you say?
Well, we were fully staffed. We would have 12, but we were sitting around 10. So There were some really tight stretches where, we were really having to cancel vacation, not let people take time off because we needed to cover the residency.
Right. And there's no overtime in the military and no bonuses for that level of work. So
No. And I got paid the same at being a teaching staff as someone who was a clinic PCM. It's the same pay.
Yeah, as far as radiology goes, I mean, we were relatively well protected. At the highlight of the wars, there were, I believe, 6 radiologists that were deployed at any given time. I think now they're down to 1, 2, maybe 3. I don't recall by the time I retired, but so that really changed a little bit. We started being able to use teleradiology in theater, actually, so you could reduce the number of radiologists that were actually boots on the ground, although you still kind of wanted to have one at various locations.
Yeah.
But the time that we were at Nellis, you deployed twice. I deployed once, and you spent a year training away from the family.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these are some of the sacrifices I think, when you're a medical student looking at the financial benefits of getting your school paid for, you don't always think about. And, and no one really can think 20 years or 15 years into the future, but something to definitely consider before just making the strict financial decision. It's not just a financial decision. Obviously, like we said, there are some benefits that you can't really put a price on for working for people who've worn the uniform and being one of those people. But it is something to definitely think about. So let's talk a little bit specifically about, you guys mentioned this, about the financial aspects of military medicine versus your civilian colleagues in both, the primary care field and then also the specialty field.
Well, I think for starters, what's nice about it is that you come out of med school ideally without a whole bunch of debt. And if you are really set on primary care, it's been very beneficial because, one, your salaries will they still may be a little bit lower right off the bat, but certainly after a couple of years, from my understanding.
I think probably by the time I passed the 12 to 14 year in service, I was making enough, and I was making probably more in bonuses with the vast majority of family medicine. So it took several years to get to that point where my pay was increased, but I'm pretty certain the last 4 or 5 years, I was making more than most of my counterparts would have been able to make as a family medicine physician. But
also, you hear stories about people that actually want to do primary care, but they don't feel they can afford to, coming out with $60,000, $100,000, $140,000 of debt. You see a lot of articles about that's why a lot of people aren't going into primary care. So if you are going into primary care, it can be good. In fact, I don't know, but I remember as probably as recent as 5-7 years, I heard of some civilian pediatricians that were making, under $100,000. Yeah. Which just seems ridiculous. Yeah. But so primary care can come a little bit closer. Obviously, as a radiologist, from what I've heard, what some of my colleagues are making, it's maybe 50%, 60%, depending on as you get along. You have various bonuses for time in service and signing multi-year contracts of guarantee, and you can get relatively close. But I think from what I've heard, a lot of the specialists aren't going to be very close to the civilian counterparts.
Right. And I think that's generally true, amongst the different specialties, radiology, anesthesia, some of the surgical specialties. Right. Like you had said earlier, though, Jenny, the workload. You could have been at a small peripheral clinic where you didn't see that many patients, and you would have got paid the same as you were during your intense teaching time. With tons of patients and
inpatient, right? So most of the family medicine physicians in the Air Force are at an outpatient clinic. So they'll work 5 days a week, every holiday off, every weekend off. They may have mommy call, or they may have to take a call, but certainly they're not coming in for deliveries. They're not coming in on the weekends to do
around for 6 hours.
Around and teach residents and stuff like that. Right. But again, that's also a choice. They're not going to force anybody to go to a teaching program. So you kind of pick your poison.
Right. Yeah. Right. So you're retired now. Yay. Yep. And you're traveling the world. So let's talk a little bit about the golden parachute of the military, the pension.
The thing we were talking about is that, it's changed over the last year and a half. So everything that we know about our multi-year bonuses, about the retirement, it's totally changed. So what little we know, like right now, we were on the old school, you needed to have 20 years minimum or it was nothing. 19 years gets you nothing, 20 years gets you everything. And that's 50% of your base salary. So, for those wondering, for my wife and I, it's about $50,000 a year each. So that's based on a retired 20 years as a lieutenant colonel. Some of our colleagues will be full bird colonels, which is probably another, $5,000 a year, something like that. But now you actually accrue certain types of benefits, almost like a 401k as you start. And so if you separate it 8 years, you separate it 12 years, you have something in the bank. Although it's certainly, nothing comparable to what you have at 20. If you do get to 20, I still believe it's actually a little bit less, maybe 40 to 45% of your annual salary. So they've changed it a little bit, but for our practical purposes, being able to retire from the military at 44, 45, 46 for you, 45 for me, it allows us the flexibility to take a year off, kind of decide what we want to do. You don't have to immediately jump into a civilian practice or your second job. And so that's one of the things that's allowed us to do this year-long trip.
One other thing before we talk about your travel, you also get health benefits, correct?
Yes. There's a couple different ways you get health benefits. Is if you want to join the TRICARE program, which is the military healthcare, one of the military healthcare systems, you pay a very small annual fee to be enrolled in TRICARE. And I think the fee for the whole entire family was $500
for the year.
Pretty ridiculous. Yeah. If you decide that you don't want to buy into the TRICARE, then you still are eligible for care, but it's more on a space available basis. And so you're limited. Now, if you, depending on what your VA benefits are, like what diseases you had, you may get additional disability and be able to pursue the VA healthcare system. And the VA healthcare system is still an unknown for us as far as like navigating it and knowing what the benefits are there. You just learn it as you pick your way along through it. But we've paid into the TRICARE system. It's a pretty good insurance or a healthcare system for a few dollars. It's not, there's a lot of older retirees that say, oh, well, that's not what I was told. I was told I get free healthcare for life. But healthcare for our family of four for under $500 for the year is a pretty good deal.
Yes. Actually, one other thing that I wanted to talk about financially, and I don't know if it's still there, but I think you guys qualify for this, is the GI Bill. So
yes. Oh, my goodness.
Let's talk about that for a little bit.
So basically, you need to be in for 4 years. Obviously, the program is designed for military members to, when they're done with the military, to go to school, whether it be learn to be a civilian pilot, whether you want to go to a cooking school, whether you want to go back to college and get a second degree. So obviously, being physicians, neither of us is really planning on going back to any extensive school. So it allows us to transfer our GI benefit to our kids. So right now, basically, both of our kids can use our GI benefit. And in a nutshell, it's 4 years of college at a state school. Usually, most state schools, all tuition is included. During certain private schools, there's a certain amount, there's a cutoff, but some private schools will actually match it. We have a friend whose daughter's going to Vanderbilt for free, basically tuition free, because I believe Vandy actually matches the GI benefit. Additionally, they get a housing allowance, and it's based on your location, and that can be anywhere from $1,200 to $2,400 a month while they're in school. Now, it's only good for about 10 months out of the year, but basically it's designed to pay for all 4 years of school. And so we've actually stopped, putting money aside into 529 plans, et cetera, because basically both of our kids can go to school for free.
And we signed up for the benefit several years ago. You had to be done with your active duty service commitment. So you had to be through the time of where you're paying back what the Air Force gave you. Okay. And of course, we signed up for it. And I don't think it was until I started talking to my friend about how they were using her GI Bill, for her daughter, and that it really started to hit. It was like, I'm so glad we did this, because you have to serve another 4 years after you sign the contract. So it's not something you can get on your way out the door. We had to time it correctly. Right. But then at home, it was like, wow, we are not looking at this huge debt to send our kids to school, having to take on loans. I mean, that's huge. My son is looking at Rice, which is a yellow ribbon school. Right. And so there's private schools that suddenly are affordable, whereas without the GI Bill, we wouldn't even be an option.
There are also some options like California state schools, I believe. If you're not a resident of California, but you're military,
right,
they will allow you to pay. I mean, there's just a lot of, we haven't looked too far into it because our oldest daughter is looking at culinary school. So we're kind of focusing on, how to use the GI Bill for some of the culinary schools.
Right.
But the CIA, the various CIAs will accept the GI Bill, and anything we have left over, we can actually use. Like, we know some friends, or well, we've heard stories of people that basically they go sign up for 9 hours at San Francisco, I think State University, whatever. It's in downtown San Francisco. And basically their housing allowance allows them to live there.
That's awesome.
Maybe for 9 hours, and basically they just enjoy living there. So we thought about, enrolling in some place in New York City for 2 years, and maybe we take photography and Spanish and whatever, and use the housing allowance to supplement our lifestyle in New York City. So.
That's great. I actually, so I wasn't able to, I didn't stay in long enough to be able to transfer it to my kids, but I did use it the 1 year that I did fellowship as a supplement to, for my housing allowance. So that was, And I may use it in the future because I still have about 3 years of the benefit left for an MBA program. So, but good.
Yeah, there's a lot of options there. It's just one of those things that you don't think about it until you actually start doing the math, and you realize that really adds a lot of financial security.
Absolutely.
Or at least that you don't have to put aside.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, good. Okay, so we got the financial part out of the way here. So now let's talk about the fun part. You guys are traveling around the world this year, and you've been doing it since middle of July or
late July.
Okay. All right. So where are you? Where have you been? Let's talk about that.
Okay, so we did Costa Rica, Panama City, Lima, Peru, Sacred Valley, Peru, Santiago, Chile, Mendoza, Argentina, and we're currently in Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Nice. One of my favorite cities in the world. So what gave you the inspiration to do this, and what are you wanting to do this year?
Have you ever watched the show The Amazing Race?
Yes.
So our family loves that show. We will sit down and watch it as a family. And about 6 years ago, we were watching the show, and that's when we came up with the idea that we wanted to go and see some of these places that they filmed the episodes. And so about 6 years ago, we came up with the idea that that's what we were going to do. We were going to take a year off after we retired, and we were going to travel the world.
So we started basically putting money aside, a full 5 years ago. And one of the nice things about the military pay structure, at least for physicians, although that it has since changed, is that a good portion of our salary were lump sum bonuses. Right. So we were able to use the lump sums as not your day-to-day living. You kind of learn to typically have your day-to-day expenses, your rent, et cetera, based on your yearly salary. At least we did.
Right.
And so I think towards the best part of a year, we were getting a little over $100,000 a year in a lump sum bonus. And so that's very easy to put, $25,000 a year, just boom. Don't even touch it. You put it away. And, that certainly allowed us to manage a lot of our other big expenses throughout the year. You knew you were going to take an anniversary trip. You put $10,000 aside. And so we've been doing that for 5 years, for a bulk of our, the bulk of our savings. And then, of course, we have not a lot of expenses for our retirement salary for the year that we're traveling. And so we're kind of supplementing that to make things work.
Right. We don't have any car payments. We have one car payment. We aren't renting a house, and we don't own a house, so we don't have a house payment. We don't have insurance on the house. We aren't paying large utility bills. All we have is our cell phone bill. So that helped with not owning property that has to be maintained.
Great. Now, so you guys are almost covered the Western Hemisphere. So where are you off to after Buenos Aires?
So we have about another week here. We spend 3 days in Sao Paulo,
Okay.
That's apparently the only South African city that you can fly directly across to South Africa, which is our next stop. So we're just stopping there for 3 days. Rather than just flying through, we thought we'd stay for 3 days. There's a restaurant that Jenny and I have been wanting to go to for a while. So we're going to spend 3 nights in Sao Paulo, have dinner at this restaurant, and then fly out to Africa. We'll be in Africa for about, I believe, 5 or 6 weeks or so.
Okay.
Before moving on to the Middle East.
Now,
for my listeners, how old are your kids?
So our son turned 12 just before. No, he turns 12
in Lima.
In Lima, and our daughter turns 15 next week. So they're school-age children. So our daughter is in the 10th grade, and our son is in the 7th grade. So we are doing online homeschooling with them as we travel.
And obviously the experience of, traveling around the world is invaluable, but how are you doing that school? Like, do you set aside dedicated time, or how does that work?
So ideally, they get an hour here or there most days. Like, after we've gone out exploring and we come back and we have some downtime. But we have figured out that on the new day, like the day after our travel day, our first day in a city, we really count that as a down day. And that's the day for them really to get a good 5 or 6 hours worth of schoolwork done. Okay. And then if we're in a place for 7 or 8 days, we may explore the town for 3 days, but then we take another school day. So today was a down day for the kids. We went out to lunch, but we haven't really been out exploring, doing a bunch of things, and hopefully they got a good 5 to 6 hours of schoolwork done so that we can go and be on the go for the next couple of days.
Right. Good. I'm sure they're enjoying it. Any tips for my listeners in traveling with kids for a longer journey than, a few days or a week?
Just do it. Don't. For us, we've had this on the books for 5 years. So even though we have a high school age daughter, who if she knew about this maybe 6 months ago, she'd probably be pretty upset about having to miss one of her years in high school.
Right.
But she's been thinking about it for 5 years. We've gotten them involved, picking some of the countries, picking things along the way. And so, when it's actually time to pack up and leave, there's no way they would not want to come on the trip. But don't hesitate. Obviously, you have smaller kids. It's probably a little tougher. Our kids are very travel savvy. They've actually done quite a bit of traveling, much more so than their mom and dad at their ages.
Right.
So they're quite easy to travel with. But, you just do it. Don't let the kids hold you back. You can homeschool them. Like you mentioned, it's invaluable just seeing the way other people live. And even though we've actually been in pretty nice areas, we haven't seen a whole bunch of poverty yet. Of course,
right.
we'll get that as we hit some of the stops.
Sure.
But just the little experiences, seeing how many people in other countries actually speak English. Yeah, that's a big eye for the kids. They realize that maybe Americans aren't number one in everything.
Right.
Because there's a lot of Americans who only speak English.
Right.
Whereas you'll find taxi drivers, you'll find people at gas stations. Not all of them, but, a fair amount speak English. So there's just the little things that are just, like you mentioned, it's hard to put a kind of a price tag on that type of experience.
I say just do it. Don't wait until you've taken a year of Spanish, or wait until the kids are a certain age. They'll never be like what you think is a perfect time to do something, and you just have to take the plunge.
Absolutely.
And just go with it.
Absolutely. Now that you've been out of country for a decent amount of time, what are you missing about the U.S.?
We actually couldn't think of anything that we miss.
Wow.
No. It's nice. It's, there are days you're like, wow, wish we spoke the language, or, meaning that, we wish we could use English everywhere. But,
and then there was a period of about 3 weeks where we couldn't drink tap water. So everything was bottled water.
Right.
But we've had some time. We've had a couple of weeks where we could drink it. Obviously, when we hit, other places, we'll be back to not drinking it. But that kind of.
But no, we try to think, is there something that we're missing? And no, we can't come up with anything. We've got our kids with us, and, we have a great time as a foursome.
Right.
So.
Good. Now, on the flip side, you mentioned, the number of people speaking English was a surprise to you. Is there anything else that you're seeing abroad that you wish Americans, or that was more of in America? Attitudes, food, whatever.
I think when you're stateside, all you see is the way that we live as Americans and the way that we run our country. And, we're only one small country of the world, and the rest of the world is completely different. So seeing that, there are places that do siestas, and there's places that close down on Sundays or Mondays. Right. And that it's not necessarily as much of go, 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 go all the time. And that there are museums that are free. And it's just, I don't know, there's just an appreciation when you're outside of the United States border that other people live and act differently.
Yeah. And it's not, different isn't always bad. I mean, a lot of times different is either just as good or in some ways better. So it's a great experience when it's different from traveling. I mean, you go someplace for a week and you sort of dabble in it. But I mean, like you mentioned, we're 6 weeks out from our normal home, and you just kind of adapt, and you're like, oh, this is a little different, but it's not that bad. We'll just kind of adapt to their way of doing things, and it works out really well. Good.
Well, this is great. So now, not wanting to go beyond your trip before you guys are even, a quarter way through it, but what are your plans for when you get back to the U.S.?
We'll eventually get back. So no, we'll probably go back next summer. There's a couple things that the kids want to do in the summer, and I think our daughter really wants to have a high school experience in the United States beyond just her freshman year. So we'll go back to the States. Our retirement allows for us to not have to work full time. Right. And it allows for us to be picky in what we choose to do next or pursue next. I have no desire for full-time clinic medicine. I did that for 20 years. So that's not on my radar. I'm not going to jump into a practice. I'm not going to jump into full-time clinical work. So I'm exploring options as to what that may mean. And I think Stephen's a little undecided about what he wants.
Yeah, I interviewed with a group right before I left, kind of in anticipation of when something potentially opens up early next year, for next summer. And I've seen a couple of 3-day work options, and I think that would probably be my ideal solution. I also wouldn't mind, I had a pretty nice moonlighting job in California. And if I could somehow turn that into, 1 week where I'm working, 40, 45 hours and just fly out there, for those 5 or 6 days, that would certainly be more than enough in conjunction with retirement. So, but I mean, if the perfect job came up, I mean, I would be perfectly fine working 5 days a week. It's just right now, the places where we want to live, which is mostly Dallas, there's not a lot of 100% breast imaging jobs out there. So still a lot of breast and body work, which is not horrible, but right now I'm not ready to jump into a 5 day a week, breast and body position.
Okay. Now is your, I know you've got a pretty good itinerary and travel plans, but is your return open-ended, or are you guys pretty fixed on when you'll be back?
Well, I mean, it's not, we really don't have any airline tickets after January. We have tentative plans, but we also will probably be back in the States in May for a transition time to get over to Europe. Right. We actually have Harry Potter and the Cursed Child play tickets for, I believe, June in London. Yeah. So at some point, we have to get to at least England in June, but we'll probably not spend the time we thought, gallivanting across Europe and Eastern Europe like we thought. We may just try saving that for another year, especially since there's a good chance that, we may not go back to a full-time, 40-hour-a-week job. So we might be doing 3 or 4 months in Europe, next summer. But it's still pretty open-ended.
Gotcha. And being out for an extended period gives you a little bit more flexibility. So I think enjoy that, because that's one of the best parts of travel, as you guys already know, is just the freedom and the flexibility to do things. So let me ask you this. Now that you've been out there for a little while, and you guys obviously had planned this really well, and you'd set aside money, like you said, are the costs in line with what you had thought initially? Are they cheaper, or is it more?
No. We're basically, we've been fluctuating between plus 100 minus $100 over the course of I kind of broken it down into the various locations. So, Lima, we might have actually been $100 under budget, and Santiago, we were $100 over budget.
Okay.
And that's actually with a lot of splurges. You'll go and you buy $100 of wine, which is not a necessary, but for the most part, things have been planning out pretty well. Mm-hmm. So far, so good, and we haven't even begun to hit our free hotel stays. So we have a lot of free hotels from, credit card, miles, points, and all that sort of stuff, beginning in Africa. We'll hopefully, make up some ground. And then when we get to like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and places where you kind of want to splurge, it all evens out. But so far, the costs have really been on track. And that's without really being conscious about it. There's very few times where we're like, should we get this? Should we not get this? Everything's been, you want it, you get it. At the end of the little weeks, the week here, week there, we've pretty much been on track.
But it's different when you're traveling for a year. You're less inclined to collect items as you go along than if you're somewhere for just a week.
Right.
So
that's a good point, because basically you're having to take everything that you have in a very limited amount of space. So nice. And I'm sure you guys have become, if you weren't already, experts at packing and unpacking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jenny's done a good job.
Yes.
And the nice thing is my parents have actually met us at a couple of places. So as we finish up pretty much our cold periods, we'll be in the Southern Hemisphere for the next 6 weeks or so. And of course, it's getting warmer and warmer here. And then when we flip, then we'll pretty much be hanging around the equator before heading back to the Southern Hemisphere for like Australia, New Zealand. So we're able to kind of dump off a lot of our warmer gear. So we're actually, every time we see my parents, we're sending them back to the States with, a couple of clothing items.
Okay. Nice. That's the way to do it. I think that's great. I enjoyed catching up with you guys after a few years. And I want to thank you for participating in this podcast. Tell me about the blog you guys are doing.
So we have a blog, Bepko's Go Global .blog, and we're chronicling different areas of interest as we're traveling. So we're trying to post on the cities that we visit, what our experiences were in the cities, some of the great meals, because Stephen and I are foodies that we've had. What else? I'm posting on my runs. I'm a big runner. Stephen's a runner too, but the running that we experience each week in the different locations, some packing, traveling tips are on there, and we try to update it a couple times a week.
It's still a work in progress. Even six weeks into it, it's just we're getting a little bit more into the groove of things. But
well, we had a couple weeks with really sketchy internet connection, and so we got pretty far behind. So trying to catch up has been difficult.
Right.
Bepko's Go Global .blog.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. We'll put a link to it in our show notes, and we'll keep checking in on you guys every few months to see where you're at. But thanks, and great catching up with you. Thanks for listening to this episode. I want to thank the Bepkos for talking with me, and I wish them continued safe travels. At the time of recording, they were in Argentina, but have since gone to Africa, the Middle East, India, Singapore, and are now in New Zealand, I believe. They are now slightly more than halfway through their trip, and you can follow along with their journey on their travel blog. The link is in the show notes, but you can Google Bepko's Go Global, and that'll also connect you. Once again, thanks for listening. Please let your friends and colleagues know about this podcast by sharing it via text, WhatsApp, or whatever Facebook or other social media platform you're on. These episodes are also available at drmoneymatters.com and on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher. And just remember to leave us positive reviews if you can. It helps other colleagues find this podcast. And do that for any other podcasts you listen to. There are many good physician podcasts out there now. And my colleagues who are doing so at Docs Outside the Box, The Hippocratic Hustle, Doctors on The Happy Doc, and White Coat Investor are all physicians with good podcasts that I recommend you listen to. I'll have a link for these podcasts on the show notes as well. Finally, I encourage all of you to join the Facebook Dr. Money Matters group, where you can ask questions of other community members in the group and discuss topics we talked about on the show. Once again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.